She's helping us out today. So thank you once again to everyone for joining us for this National Girls Collaborative Project webinar, supporting equitable approaches to early science education. And we will go ahead and get started. My name is Amanda Sullivan, and I manage our national webinars here at the National Girls Collaborative Project. And I'm really thrilled that you're here to see this webinar on a topic that's so important and interesting to me personally as an early childhood educator, someone with an early childhood background. I think we can't talk about reaching these early grades enough, and I'm thrilled about the speakers that we have here today. And we will get started with meeting our speakers in just a few minutes, but a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, so everyone will have access to the slides, the recording, and the chat after the event is completed. I'd like to ask you to stay muted, but feel free to chat away in the chat. Ask your questions, make your comments, share resources, and there will be a point later in the webinar where we will look in the chat and ask you questions and interact with you a little bit. We have a little bit of an activity for all of you today, which is fun. We don't always do that on these events. And if you have any issues, you need any help with any technical difficulties or have a question about NGCP that you want answered, my colleague, Nancy Scales-Coddington, you will see her a lot in the chat, sharing links and helping you out. So let's get started. Before we go into meeting our wonderful speakers today, in case some of you are joining us for your first NGCP event, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on who we are and what we do. So our vision is what you see on screen here. We are a national network of diverse stakeholders who are advancing the agenda in gender equity. We bring together organizations that are committed to informing and encouraging girls to consider STEM. As a network of networks, our reach is broad. The programs in our network serve 20 million girls. And because many of our programs also serve boys, we've been serving over around 12 million boys as well. NGCP has been transforming STEM for 20 years. And at the heart of it, our vision is simple. We hope to create STEM experiences that are as diverse as the world we live in and reflective of the world that we live in. You can see our 3 essential goals on screen here: to build and sustain a network, to catalyze equity in STEM, and to increase our collective impact. So let me unpack that a little bit. NGCP believes that STEM skills can be acquired by anyone and fostered in everyone. Our initiatives build confidence and create a community of lifelong STEM activators. Through the power of collaboration, those of you who follow NGCP know we're all about collaboration. We spark curiosity and develop a passion for STEM. We share resources and solutions with a coalition of leaders, and via our website, newsletters, online databases, social media, and of course, webinars like this one. NGCP also strengthens the capacity of programs by sharing exemplary practices, research, and program models. We believe that when programs are stronger and more sustainable, girls and youth are better served. And we distribute these resources in accessible ways like train-the-trainer programs and online platforms. And finally, we leverage our network of girls-serving STEM programs, advocates, and youth so that together we can create the tipping point for gender equity in STEM. And we're always quite busy. We're doing a lot. I just want to share about a few of our activities, especially because many of these activities have resources or websites that might be interesting to you. And as I'm sharing about them, my colleague Nancy will be popping any relevant links for you in the chat. So NGCP engages in many activities, virtual activities, as well as in-person national activities and local activities through our collaboratives. NGCP partners with organizations to scale and deliver content, such as the Leap into Science National Network in partnership with the Franklin Institute, and the Million Girl Moonshot in partnership with STEM Next and the Mott After School State Networks, serving hundreds of educators via local networks. Working with Lyda Hill Philanthropies, NGCP manages the If Then collection, a digital library housing photos, videos, and other media of women in STEM fields that are available at no cost. And there's also activities on there as well. Definitely a great resource to check out. We host a youth advisory board. If you follow our social media, you might have seen us recently announcing our new cohort of youth advisory board members. But our youth advisory board helps to review and provide feedback on our current NGCP initiatives. And they really help be that youth voice guiding the future direction of what we do at NGCP. And they're amazing. I definitely suggest you check out our youth advisory board. FabFems is an international database of female role models from many STEM fields. They are passionate about the work they do, and they're ready to connect with programs to spark girls' interests. And locally, our state collaborative leadership teams offer convenings and professional developments, mini grants for projects when funding is available, and they also distribute their own regular newsletters spotlighting local resources. I won't say too much about the national webinars because I think you know about them. You found us here today. You just might not know that we actually offer them every month, sometimes more than one per month. We have another great webinar coming up at the end of this month. So if you're interested in learning about our webinars, you can check them out on our events page, which is where we always post them. And lastly, I wanted to say that if you don't already subscribe to our newsletter, you're missing out. You can be the first to know about all of our events, in-person events, online events, our resources, free resources when we have them, new research reports and things like that. So I definitely suggest that you sign up for that newsletter. We'll put that link in the chat as well. Whew. That kind of felt like a lot, but I hope that gave you some background on what we do at NGCP. And I'm so thrilled now to be moving on to why we are all here today to learn about how we can support equitable approaches to early science education. And the two speakers that we have here today are two people that I deeply respect and deeply admire. And I'm so thrilled that they will be sharing their work and their advice with all of us today. And it just is a strange coincidence that they're both named Amanda and that I'm also named Amanda. And this actually has never happened on a webinar that I've hosted before, but there is a first time for everything. So hopefully it won't be too confusing, and maybe it will be even better. All you have to do is ask a question to someone named Amanda in the chat, and at least one person, if not three people, will answer your question. So let me first introduce Amanda Cardarelli. I've been following her research, reading everything she's done from the minute a colleague of mine forwarded me some information about her and the work that she did. It's so compelling. Amanda Cardarelli is a researcher at the Education Development Center, or EDC, where she co-leads and contributes to studies that examine how media and digital educational resources can support learners and educators. Before joining EDC, she was a teacher at an international school in Ecuador and spent 5 years working at NYU in a cognitive developmental research lab. While at NYU, she co-led a National Science Foundation-funded research initiative that investigated how language used to teach science affects children's engagement with science. And that's the research she's going to be sharing with us today. So I'm thrilled that she's here. We're also joined by Dr. Amanda Strawhacker. I'm so honored and excited to have you here today. I know Amanda Strawhacker from way back, over a decade now. We went to graduate school together and we worked together at Tufts for many years. So I'm just thrilled that she's here to share some of her experiences with us. Amanda Strawhacker is the STEAM coordinator at the Solomon Schechter Day School of Greater Boston. Her work involves teaching, developing curriculum, and professional development around educational technology for pre-K through 8th grade classrooms. Prior to her role at Schechter, Amanda was the Associate Director of the Early Childhood Technology Graduate Certificate Program at Tufts University. Through her work at Tufts and with the DevTech Research Group, she contributed to the development of several educational technologies, including the Scratch Junior Programming app, the Kibo Robotics Kit, the Early Childhood Makerspace at Tufts, and most recently, the Crispy Bioengineering Kit. Amanda holds a PhD in Child Study and Human Development from Tufts University. So welcome to both of our speakers. Welcome to everyone here, named Amanda and otherwise. And I would now like to turn it over to Amanda Cardarelli. Amanda?
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction. And yes, so I'm Amanda Cardarelli, and as Amanda mentioned, I'm a senior research associate at Education Development Center, but I'm going to be presenting today on my research from NYU and the CDSC lab. Next slide, please. Okay, so jumping right in. As we're all aware, women are still significantly underrepresented in many STEM fields, but how and why does this happen? Understanding the roots of this disparity might help us learn how to change it. Next slide, please. So we know that children develop stereotypes about scientists starting in early childhood. The Draw a Scientist test is a classic measure of children's stereotypes about science, with drawings like this one demonstrating that children often associate scientists with white men. And these early developing stereotypes hinder girls' science engagement. Next slide, please. So given these past studies, we wanted to understand how these stereotypes develop and why they might be affecting girls' engagement with science. Next slide, please. So we hypothesize that this has to do with the language we use to introduce children to science. Language has a profound effect on how children form categories such as objects, people, and animals. And the language that children hear when they learn about science affects children's understanding of the category scientists and who fits in that category. Next slide. So, children's books, media, and teachers often introduce young children to science using identity-focused language about scientists. They often also invite children to pretend that they're scientists to learn science. So this is very common, and although they mean well, these phrases suggest to children that scientists are a special and distinct kind of person, and that being good at science or successful in science depends on who you are versus what you can do. Next slide, please. And because the scientists that children learn about are overwhelmingly white and male, this may lead some children to believe that science is only for certain kinds of people and that maybe they can't succeed in science because of who they are. Our hypothesis was that because of this common scientist language, children from groups traditionally underrepresented in STEM might disengage from science, especially when they experience any sort of a setback that might make them question whether or not they fit the category of a scientist. Next slide, please. In our research, we set out to examine the effects of identity-focused scientist language compared with action-focused language, such as doing science. Action-focused language instead describes science as an activity that people do rather than as a person, a kind of person, or an identity. Next slide, please. So to study the effects of language on children's science engagement, we worked with over 130 preschool teachers and their students across all 5 boroughs of New York City to observe the language that teachers actually use in their classrooms to teach science. Next slide, please. So we gave every teacher the materials to teach a science lesson that you see here. So this lesson was about friction. So these materials included the ramp that had different textures that could attach to it. It had a rainbow map for children to predict how far a toy car would roll based on the amount of friction from the different textures, and a poster to record children's observations of the different textures, their predictions, and the results. Each teacher audio recorded their lesson so we could code for the language they used. There was a lot of variability in the language that teachers used, but identity-focused scientist language was by far the most common. Next slide, please. So here is a quote from a teacher using the common identity-focused scientist language. Before I read it, I want you to think about how you would feel hearing this as a pre-K age child. Scientists have a really cool job. They think about something and they create a smart thought. But it's really cool because today, as a scientist, you're going to ask yourself a big question. And the big question that you're asking yourself is, what is friction? So you can tell the teacher is trying to get the kids excited about science by having them pretend to be scientists. But this quote also, to me at least, makes scientists seem like a special group that's just for really smart adults. Next slide, please. Now, in comparison, think about how you would feel as a pre-K age student hearing this quote from a teacher that used action-focused language instead. Okay, so today we're going to do science. Doing science means exploring the world and using our 5 senses. Today we're going to be doing science and learning about something called friction. So here, the idea of doing science and using our senses feels more accessible for a child. Next slide, please. So to measure the effects of teacher language on child engagement, we also, of course, had to work with the students. So after teachers taught the friction lesson and audio recorded it, my team visited each classroom and let kids play a friction game we developed to measure science persistence. Next slide, please. So the game did not measure if kids made correct guesses. That's not what it was set out to do. Instead, we measured how long kids would persist after a setback, which is an inevitable part of doing science. So to do this, the game would always give kids feedback that they made an incorrect guess, so we could measure if they would persist after experiencing the setback. Next slide, please. So we found that the more times a teacher said scientist while teaching the lesson, the less likely children were to persist in the game. So there's a negative correlation between identity-focused language and child engagement. This was particularly true for girls, indicating that using action-focused language can encourage girls to persist in science after experiencing a setback. Next slide, please. So what can we do? Most importantly, use action-focused language when you teach science. Scientist language hinders girls from persisting in science, but switching to action-focused language mitigates this disengagement. It's encouraging, I think, to know that after just one lesson, action-focused language can have a positive effect, especially on young girls' engagement in science. So it's never too late to make this shift. You know, don't think that if you've been talking about scientists that you've ruined children. We can change it at any time and it will have positive effects. And beyond just using action-focused language, you can also talk about science as a process that anyone can do. Maybe not everyone can be a scientist, but everyone can do science and we all do it all the time. Lastly, encouraging questioning as a part of the process of doing science. Kids are naturally inquisitive and letting them know that when they ask questions or make predictions, they're doing science. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to learn more about this research, you can visit the lab's website, kidconcepts.org. Or if you're interested in participating in this sort of research with your own children, you can check out discoveriesinAction.org. And now for even more practical tips, I'm going to pass it over to Amanda Strawhacker.
Thank you so much, Amanda Cardarelli. I've now spoken to you a couple times and I was researching a lot of your findings before this. And I think like all of us on this call, it has really caused me to reflect and think about my own talk and work with children. So I'm really excited to be here to share from a little bit more of the practice side. So I'm working in a pre-K to 8 setting right now. And actually, as I was reflecting and thinking about Amanda Cardarelli's research, I found it sort of helpful to think about examples of language. And in preparation for this call, I was just thinking about things that were sort of surfacing in science classes in my school that I thought, or I hope are sort of reflective of a lot of those teaching moments we might catch ourselves in where we're like, oh, this is one of those times when I know there's probably a way that I could be elevating the equity here or talking more richly about science. And maybe let's just unpack that moment a little bit together on this call. Thank you, Amanda. Next slide. So before we start, I always like to think about inclusion in this way. I know many of you have probably seen this visual before from the Interaction Institute for Social Change, but I like to revisit it every time I think about designing a lesson or think about teaching from a collective perspective. So you may have seen the image where equality means everyone gets the same supports, maybe the same size block to see over a wall, and equity means thinking specifically about what everyone needs to succeed in your classroom or your learning setting and making sure they get that, even if it's not equal. If you look at the next slide, I actually also really like this new addition from the Center for Story-Based Strategy. They really challenge us to wonder why we have that wall there in the first place. And I think about this a lot when I'm introducing a new tool or technology, or introducing a new scientific experiment or question to the students I work with. What's the way that I can do this in a way that says yes to what the kids are asking me or wanting to try? What's a way to do this that offers liberation, offers freedom in the actual experimentation and the joy of learning, that doesn't require a whole lot of extra planning and materials grabbing on my end, but is just set up in a way that invites everyone in? So that's just a way to frame how I'm thinking about this conversation. You know, we have a lot of people in the room, and we have so much brain power about how to elevate women in STEM. I think all of the women in STEM on this call really care about that question. But I think it's also really important to think about how to lower the barriers for everyone, so that women in STEM doesn't have to be a special group that we're necessarily catering to. It's just people in STEM, and we're making it available for everyone to participate. So on the next slide, I'm going to dive right into I mentioned some of these examples of, I'm going to do actually similar to the quote example that Amanda Cardarelli shared, of what might happen in a classroom, and then how we might re-envision it or alter a teaching move to spark a different kind of conversation. And all of these, I will remind you, are names protected, but rooted in real or similar examples from my learning setting. So I first want to talk about building shared language in a science community. So in this example, a teacher has brought out a snail for the students to examine on their tables. And as they're watching the snails, the teacher asks, how does this snail protect itself? Mona says they have a thingy on top. And the teacher says, okay, can we be more specific? Fishing for a little bit more detail on the snail body. Mona is not sure. She sort of passes the buck. And Yuval says the shell. So the teacher says, yes, the shell. Okay, so let's move on to talk about how the snail moves. So I want you to think about how it feels to be Mona in this classroom and how it feels to be Yuval in this classroom. And if you feel like, if you're Mona, you might not know how to participate in this science conversation because you don't either have a vocabulary term, or you don't know what we mean by being more specific. What's the teacher looking for here? Then maybe you would appreciate the teaching move on the next slide. So here, the same beginning, teacher asks, how does the snail protect itself? And Mona says they have a thingy on top. And the teacher takes this as an opportunity to turn this question back to the classroom. Interesting. So Mona sees something on the top of the snail. Can you describe it? So now we're already getting into observing with our five senses in a very organic way. And Mona can answer this question. She says it's brown and it's hard. So even though she doesn't know the vocabulary term shell, she can answer this. And the teacher says, okay, so this brown and hard thing might be helping the snail stay protected. Can we give this thing a name? Ellie says it's the snail's house, and Yuval says it's made of a shell. So I bolded here two teaching moves. One is not just moving on from an unclear description, but the other is actually asking the children in the room to come up together collectively with a term for what it is we're exploring here. Because we're not doing science because we assume that there is a textbook answer we're all trying to get to. We don't want the kids to go in and understand that the teachers have the answer and they're just hiding them from us until we sort of get the right password. We want them to really think of themselves as agents of inquiry, and we're together collectively answering questions that we don't know the answer to. So that's why it's okay if we give it a name and we don't know what other people have also already named it. That's what research is for, and we get to that stage in the scientific process. Next slide. Okay, so in addition to building shared language, I find it really, really important, and maybe this is the most challenging one, to follow the kids' curiosity. Now, there's such a fine line between following their curiosity and watching the room kind of lose itself and go haywire. So I do hear that challenge, and I'm curious how others in this group think about that boundary, that balance. But I want to share an example that really happened, and I thought it was so interesting how from beginning to end this conversation evolved. So the teacher says, this was actually slightly older kids, so they were talking about the human digestive system. The teacher says, so what happens when we take food into the stomach? And they had just completed a science experiment where they were doing a chemical reactions. So the student Paris says, oh, your food in your stomach, it gets crunched. And wait a minute, is that how vomit happens? Like you're spewing food? And immediately the teacher says, wait, Paris, that's not appropriate. That's not what we're talking about right now. And Paris says, but wait, can I finish? And the teacher says, Paris, first warning, who can explain the stomach acid to me? Now, maybe the language feels a little different or a little abrupt from how it might happen in your classroom, but I think we can all remember a moment when we've been there, when actually the right teaching move might have been to stop the derailing of this conversation and focus back on what we were talking about. But if you're feeling like that's actually not the best, like that's not the teacher I want to be, or maybe I wish there was a way that I could let that child sort of surface what it is they were curious about or what was going on if they were going to finish that thought, then let's take a look at what happens on the next slide. Again, this is a real example. So the teacher says, what happens when we take food in the stomach? Paris brings up his vomit idea and he finishes it this time. He says, you're spewing food because there's too much acid and it bubbles up. So you can sort of see he's making that connection to their chemical reaction experiment that they were doing earlier in the day. So the teacher validates this potentially off-topic idea. Interesting idea. What do folks think about Paris's question? Dangerous teaching move. We're going to talk to the whole class about vomit. Do we have chemical reactions in our stomachs? So this is actually a way that the teacher is sort of retracking the student's potentially off-topic idea and saying, I see how you got there. I'm going to help you verbalize what it is you're thinking about. So to the class, do we have chemical reactions in our stomachs? Audrey volunteers that her dad has acid reflux and he says he feels acid come up his throat sometimes and kind of asks it as a question. Maybe that's related. And Paris says, so yeah, I'm right. The stomach acid works like the vinegar and makes bubbles or something. So again, the language is not precise, but they're making the connection here that actually there is something related between something visceral, disgusting, appealing to the potentially young child who likes to think about vomit and stomach acid. And there's also something really useful to learn about the experiment that we're running in our classroom that might help us understand things that happen in our daily lives. Okay, so next slide. This is my last little example like this. So my favorite move in the classroom, distributing expertise. In this example, Amaya has a question. She asks, why does the moon change shape like that? Their first grade class is exploring moons and moon phases. And the teacher, at this point, Maya should know, they've gone over this a few times. And the teacher says, oh, actually it doesn't. You remember, it looks just that way, or it just looks that way because of the angle of the sun. And Amaya says, okay, I understand that. But what about when it's only a little sliver, a little curve like last night? And the teacher sees, okay, she's working through something that we've gone over again and again, and she has some misunderstanding about this idea and says, you know what, I actually don't have time right now to answer every question that we have. So why don't we talk about that after class? And Amaya says, okay. So if you're Amaya, you're sort of thinking, all right, I guess I have to wait until the purveyor of scientific information is ready to share with me that the wisdom and the knowledge that I don't have. It's not a great place to be as a teacher to feel like you have to constantly be answering and iterating the same question over and over again. So what could the teaching move be here? Let's look at the next slide. So Amaya's question, why does the moon change shape like that? This time the teacher says, that's an interesting question. Does anyone have ideas about the moon changing shape? Because at this point, remember, the kids have gone over it. Maybe someone else knows something that might be able to help Amaya. Ria says, it doesn't really. I think it's just like the light in our basketball experiment. So if you don't have the context here, the teacher's filling it in. Okay, so Ria, are you remembering when we used flashlights to see the shadow on a basketball? And Ria says, yes, the basketball didn't change shape. It just had darkness on part of it. So the teacher then, this is the distributing expertise part, going in a step further into distributing practices, says, okay, Ria and Amaya, I'm going to put you two in conversation. Do you want to try that experiment again today at snack? Maybe we can pretend the basketball is the moon. So not only does the teacher now have a little bit of a free period, letting another child teach to the person who had the question, and you can sit back and sort of see how both kids are understanding this idea now, but it really validates that Amaya and Ria can answer these questions on their own with the knowledge that they have, instead of waiting for an expert to tell them the answer. Next slide. So I want to reiterate the 3 tips that we went over, and I have a couple more for you, things that you can try in your science class. if you find yourself asking, can you be more specific? Or I'm not sure what you mean by that. Could you instead try to use their words, use the words that they gave to you? We can name it the thing that you're talking about. It's okay to use those words until we decide on a better definition. And then ask, what are other ways we can think of to describe this? This taps into their observational skills, their 5 senses skills. And it also avoids a tricky issue we see sometimes with our high-performing students, where they know advanced vocabulary and they might drop it and pepper it through their conversation. And they actually are just masking that they don't know what that word means, but they get a check mark from an adult every time they use it. So you want to, even with kids who don't know or who appear to know the vocabulary word, you want to always be surfacing more, asking for more information. When you find yourself in that moment where you feel like a kid is just off task or the student's sort of not really being appropriate, sometimes it is the right move to step in and say, oh, you know what, that's actually making some of our friends in the room feel unsafe or uncomfortable. But in some cases, you might be able to say, you know, can you help me out? Tell me how you got there from what we're doing here in our activity. Sometimes it might just be, oh, you know, I actually wasn't really thinking about the activity. But you can offer the trust that they might be trying to make a connection and they're just not sure yet how to vocalize it. Instead of directly answering a question, this is a big one that comes up a lot in science classes because you can very often you just know the answer off the top of your head. Why don't you try crowdsourcing knowledge from your community, really reinforcing that everyone is a co-investigator and you are not just the expert. And then on the next slide, I know we have time, so I'm going to wrap up here. Instead of steering someone off. So actually, this is interesting because Amanda Cardarelli's experiment used this as sort of an experimental design. Ooh, that wasn't quite right. Could you try offering the same question to someone else or asking if others have a thought about the original idea? Maybe there's a dialogue the students could have and others do have confusion about that question. And then finally, if you have a student that you just constantly hear from, instead of calling that out and like, you know, Zev, we all know, everyone knows, you know a lot about science. Why not just randomly call on anyone? If we don't know the answer, it's okay. Sometimes teachers don't know the answer either. And you can just model what it looks like to ask friends for help if you don't know, because that's acceptable as well as knowing the answer. Everyone in our class is a participant in our dialogue. Okay, so I don't know if we have time to get to all of the rest that I wanted to, oh, okay, we're good. Okay, so if you take anything else away, I just want to reiterate, and I think we all know this, science takes time. When we do science in our homes, when we do our own experimentations on learning or with our kids, we know that it takes time. So why wouldn't we offer it as much as we can? I think this is probably the easiest way to break down that wall to make sure that everyone has the same opportunities and the same availability and access to these ideas. And if you're wondering, you know, how much science should I do? How much time do I give? I would invite you to think about the next slide, which is remembering that learning also takes time. So however much time you think the learning will take, that might need to be as much time as you offer for the science lesson. I have a few more tips that you could think about on the next slide. These are like just in the back of your mind. As you're trying to classroom manage, make sure to help kids. Have you heard step up and step back? If you know you're the kind of person who loves to volunteer and talk and talk and talk, that again goes back to just sort of picking randomly, inviting others into our dialogue, finding different ways to foster group dialogue besides a large group conversation. I heard someone in the chat ask, like, what about highlighting role models? Well, I think there is a lot of opportunity to highlight diverse scientists who are not often talked about in classrooms, and just a few are listed here with various diverse backgrounds and learning abilities. And of course, if we're talking about girls, I really feel strongly that we should focus on collaborative investigations, because the research has shown consistently again and again that these competitions and science fairs and all of the things that we do to sort of pit students against each other drives boys and turns girls off, and we don't want to see that. So if you want a ton more amazing practice recommendations, I would point you to two of my favorite references on the next slide. Black Ants and Buddhists by Mary Cowhey, and Breaking the STEM Stereotype by our very own Amanda Sullivan, MC of this call. I think these two books for me are like manuals in ways to really surface children's inquiry and help them see themselves as people who can do science, people who can participate, be part of the conversation, and elevate the learning to things we want to see children engaging in when we're stepping into science class. So thanks so much for having me, guys.
Well, thank you both, Amanda Cardarelli and Amanda Strawhacker. As someone who thought I was very familiar with both of your work and have read and chatted with you both, I still learned so much from the examples that you both shared, especially the quotes and talking through real classroom scenarios. And as I think other people have mentioned, since being introduced to Amanda Cardarelli's research, I've tried to make that conscious shift when I'm in the classroom or when I'm with my own preschool age children. And so this is just really, really interesting. And I love hearing research and tips that cause me to rethink what I'm doing. And I'm sure that many of you have a lot of questions that we want to talk about. So I will be looking in the chat and seeing what questions you have, what questions have been coming up. And I got a couple of questions that got sent in directly to me. So I'm going to start with those, and then I will look in the chat, and feel free to keep putting your questions in, sending them directly to me or to everyone in the chat. So the first question I had for Amanda Strawhacker is, what do you do about children who don't speak at all? Do you have any tips?
Definitely. So I don't, if you're like, you can raise your hand in the chat if that's you. You might have some kids who don't speak at all, or we also, in a variety of schools I've worked at, we have kids who want to speak and speak and speak, but not at all about what you're talking about. So I have a couple suggestions for that. The first, and I think many of you are probably familiar with, think, pair, share, different dialogue forms that don't necessarily culminate with a large group conversation. I think often we think that, in a circle with the teacher sort of coordinating and orchestrating is the way to sort of understand where everyone's at in the conversation. And I want to give you permission now to dismiss that idea, because sometimes the best way to sort of let the kids voice or find their voice to begin with is to just let them talk with each other, talk with a pair or with someone that's not as sort of stress inducing as an adult, or just to sit and reflect on their own. Maybe there's been a lot of chatter about visual images in the chat. I could envision, for example, use your observational skills by tracing a picture that I give you that's a laminated photo that everyone gets a chance to hold. And maybe someone points to something and you comment as the teacher on what they're pointing at. And with slightly older kids, you could have them write or draw responses in a lab notebook, or you could just provide a topic relevant alternative, a legal alternative. You can read a book about what we're talking about in this corner of the room. You could pick a piece of this project that we're not going to get into, but if you're really passionate about it, we're doing moons, but if you love the black hole thing, great. You go and write a black hole research project and you share it with us when you're done. But if you're not able to participate, that's okay too. We're just going to keep going with our unit on the moon.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. Amanda Cardarelli, in your research, did you study the impacts of this type of language that you talked about, the action versus identity language, in any other contexts besides like the formal pre-K classroom setting?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. What I presented on today was really the first iteration of this project. And since then, this has gone in a number of directions. We've tended to focus on pre-K age just because that's when children enter, sort of formal, whoever considers pre-K formal schooling, and hear this language and start to develop these stereotypes, and we see these shifts in engagement. So that's why we've focused on that. But beyond just the pre-K classrooms, we've also worked with parents to see the language that parents use and how that affects children. We've done specific ed media, so developing online programs to see how children engage with this language and how that affects their interest as well. And across all of those, we found the same effects. We did also replicate a study similar to this with elementary age school children. at elementary age, you know what I mean? And that also had the same effect. So again, this action-focused language really across contexts and across time. So we also studied this longitudinally with pre-K age children. So it makes a difference. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, that was a great question. So maybe just a quick follow-up. I know we're getting a lot of questions in now. So you talked about other settings and parents and things like that. Do you have any suggestions for resources to help empower parents and guardians cultivate these dialogues?
So I'm not an expert on the resource end. Maybe Amanda Strawhecker would have more examples for that. I did see questions though, specifically about like, what about, role models? And my response to that would just be, why does it have to be identity language for a role model? Why can't it be this person does science and we do science? So that's what my initial feeling is about that. I mean, of course, if we had a full diverse representation in our children's science books and in posters and classrooms and all of that, it might be different, but just because they're inundated with pictures of white men, I think that doing science and, anyone can do science, even if you're someone who's technically a scientist, you're doing science, and kids, you can ask them what they want to do when they're older versus what they want to be when they're older, things like that. So that's just another sort of thing I want to tie into that. But yeah, for resources, I'm unfortunately not an expert on that. So
Well, I will say, I think we put it in the chat, so if you haven't checked it out already, the interview I did with you with the 3 tips, educators can shift their language. I think it's completely relevant to parents and guardians and caregivers as well. Like I said, like I have 2 kids the age of your research, and I've been trying to make that conscious shift at home, not just in the classroom. So maybe Nancy can post that link back in. I think that's a better resource for parents than going directly to your research articles, which are also great because it's just really practical, like 3 things you can shift. And I think those are really relevant for home use as well. And thank you for cycling back to that question I was going to bring up that came up earlier in the chat about how do we balance the need for role models. There's other research that we know it's why it's so important to have these diverse role models with this action-focused language. And in our work at NGCP, we do a lot with role models. And it's a kind of exactly what you said, Amanda Cardarelli. We try to focus on their careers, their career journeys. What do they do? What can we relate to about their lives and what they do, and be inspired by that versus just like the label and the identity piece. I think that's one approach. Amanda Strawhecker, did you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm just thinking of ways. I was thinking of that parent piece and how to, I think often when you're trying to support parent partnership, there's a lot of sort of you talking that can feel like a wall because they're getting so much information about, it's pajama day on Thursday. And also I have to change my language around science centers. So I do feel for them and I understand the challenge. So sometimes I think it does sort of go back to that visual education that works for adults just as well as kids. So Amanda mentioned at the beginning of this call, I did research on a bioengineering project in early childhood. And I think one of the coolest experiences that came out of that was I was really committed to outfitting our makerspace with white lab coats, with goggles, with functional sound safety equipment, with gloves, with beakers, everything I could find that scientists would find in a lab. And I made them, appropriate and child-sized. And so this actually goes out maybe to museum educators and people who have a little more funding at the end of their rope. But you want to be sure that if you're doing something like that, where you're helping the kids sort of really immerse themselves in an environment and in an identity, that you're taking a picture and sending it home, because then your parents or the parents can see like, oh, they were really talking about being like what it means to be a scientist today. And like, what did you do when you were wearing this lab coat? You can even send like 3 questions to ask about the photo, and that might foster a little bit of conversation. I actually am again going to refer to Amanda Sullivan's book because I think she talks a lot about this, about watching our own gendered language at home when we have little ears around. And I also think I work a lot with robotics too. And it's interesting because all of us, adults and kids, tend to refer to robot and inanimate parts as he. So one thing you can just very easily do is like, your robots are all she, my computers are all she. And those pronouns, like we pick pronouns anyway, why not pick female ones? Just see how that works. And if the kids pick that up and bring that home. So those are my 2 cents.
Very useful, great tips for all of us. That very insightful. So thank you so much for that. And stay tuned, because Amanda Strawhacker and I are working on a parent-facing book. So definitely continue to follow, because we agree that, you know, there's so much stuff out there facing educators and researchers, but what about parents and families and caregivers? So we hope to be meeting that need for you and those of you who asked that question in the near future, which is kind of years in book talk, but we hope that that will be something that we're able to put out there. I want to just take a couple more questions. I know there's a lot of questions. I'm so thrilled about how active this chat is and how active you're all being. And then we're going to move into something a little interactive. We're going to test out how we do with our identity or our action focused language. So I think this is a great question that was asked in the chat. So should all identity-focused language be removed? So for example, and we were talking about this actually before this webinar started, many of us, when trying to remove that gendered language in the classroom, we say, good morning, writers, good morning, engineers, good morning, scientists. It stops us from that binary boys and girls that has been done in the classroom in the past. And so what are your thoughts, both of you? Maybe I'll ask Amanda Cardarelli to start first from a research perspective, and Amanda Strawhacker, then you can touch on that from the school perspective where you're currently working.
Yeah, so I would say that anything that stereotypically is a male field would be something that we want to avoid using the identity language with. But I do know that's difficult, especially as you're saying, when you're trying to avoid boys and girls or things like that. But our research, you know, it's not, we don't know that something like that is gonna break the kids' engagement. You know, I think the more times a teacher says scientists, we see kids losing engagement. I don't have any data that points to other, you know, maybe in you know, literature that's different. I really can't point to that, but I would think trying to use less identity language wherever possible is just going to be more engaging for children. So that's my thoughts, but I can, you know, try to find some new research ideas and do some more.
We're helping you develop your next NSF grant. So
Thank you.
You can thank us in the proposal. Amanda Strawhacker, do you have what do you see currently in the classroom? You supervise and coordinate all the pre-K through 8 STEAM. So how would you advise your teachers along?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question. And I hear myself, you know, I made a very explicit point at the beginning of the year with my kindergartners that we're going to be doing a lot of engineering in this room. So for this class, we're going to be engineers. And now I'm thinking like, I wonder how I could change that. But I see, for example, Megan is putting in the chat, we use friends, learners, folks. There are so many ways to call people. And honestly, I think the best buy-in, and what I have learned it from my school setting, actually, because they do an amazing job of this, is names. Using someone's name is probably the best way to engage them, to help them feel like they're a part of the community. And if you're like me and you have like 800 kids at once whose name to learn, I make a concerted effort whenever I know I'm going into a class to ask the teachers to help me out with name tags or a name ID key, or sit them at the desks with their names. But if it's for whatever reason not possible, yeah, I mean, this also makes me wonder about using terms like friends. Do we suddenly start thinking of ourselves as less friends? Like, I don't know, maybe because we spend so much time on social emotional and what it means to be a friend, it just deepens it. And it's a matter of balance. Because I know instinctively you do want the kids to get excited about that identity. So how do we do it in a way that honors that there are some people who went to school and do this for money, and it's a very different thing than what we're doing in this classroom. But we could also go with Earthlings. Yeah, I like that suggestion in the chat as well.
Earthlings, yes. Well, we don't know. We don't want to assume.
We want to be inclusive, guys.
Well, maybe I'm planning another NSF proposal, but something else the three of us I know had been chatting about is what's the difference between students claiming an identity versus adults putting an identity on them. So it may not necessarily be just like all identity language is bad, but for students to have those dress up opportunities or authentic opportunities and to label themselves a scientist or an engineer, that's maybe different than what we're talking about here with the adults talking and focusing on saying the word scientist so much and triggering that stereotype. And I lied. I'm going to pull one more question to ask Amanda Strawhacker and Amanda Cardarelli that relates to what I just said, because we do have the time, and then we will move towards the closing piece of our webinar. Do you have any suggestions, either of you, for how to address and counteract the white cis male scientist representation and messaging without playing into identity focused language? So we did talk already a little bit about role models and things like that, but if we just didn't want to play into identity language at all, what are the ways that we could counteract this stereotype? Whoever wants to jump in first, Amanda or Amanda.
Okay, well, I have a strong opinion about this one. If you are someone who is not a white cis male, and someone who loves science, then I think the best thing you can do is be a role model for your little mentees who are looking to you. Honestly, a lot of times, I spend a lot of the time that I'm talking, especially with older kids who are a little more interested in the nuance, about how, even the people who do embody those identities, scientists and engineers, one thing about being a scientist is that you spend a lot of your time thinking about questions that you don't have the answer to. In fact, scientists don't know a lot of things. And part of being a scientist means being able to say, I don't know. And that's a big one that we talk about a lot, but also showing off things that I've done or made, yeah, this is, I can tell you the answer to this because I researched it myself. This is a picture of me in a lab coat. This is a robot that I helped make. And did you know that someone who looks like me can make it? And I will have kids say, no, you didn't. Like there's no way. So, and you can find ways in your mentorship or role model capacity to really highlight, like, this was hard. This required a lot of science or math or a lot of, difficult thinking. And it's something that I did, and I didn't necessarily need someone to do it for me. I used help from my friends, but I did it. And that's because anyone can do this.
I think that's a great tip. That's definitely something that I think about a lot when parents ask me, what can I do? I don't have the knowledge about this. A lot of it is just showing, especially if you aren't that cis male scientist identity, that you can still love doing science, that you can still love the questioning. You can still sit down with your kids and engineer and build a great big tower or fail spectacularly while doing something like that and find joy in it. You have the opportunity to just model your own joy and capability. And that is just one great way to break that stereotype. It doesn't have to be these other role models. It can be all of us every day. Amanda C., did you want to say anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I love what you guys are saying. I totally reiterate that idea. I think obviously the more diverse representations of these things, then the stereotype won't have to exist anymore, which would be great.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, did I cut you off? Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say something that I think one of you said earlier was one day I hope we won't need all these women in STEM. It will just be people in STEM. And I actually heard Karen, our CEO at NGCP, once said something along the lines of when we don't need NGCP anymore, that's when we've done our job. Currently and for 20 years, we've needed to have this organization and to do this push. But truly, yeah, that is the goal for groups like ours, not to be needed and to have addressed all of these issues. Okay, in the chat now, we want to challenge you. We've talked a lot about this. So how might you shift your language to be more action focused? We'd love to hear you share in the chat maybe one thing you'll do if you have kids or students, or you work with teachers. How will you make one shift in your language? And if you need an example to think about this a little bit more, we wanted to pull something like the scientific method that we're all many of us are familiar with, or those of you who are science teachers probably have to teach with in the classroom. So how would you comment on students kind of moving through the scientific method process or learning about the scientific method? How would you do that in an action-focused way versus instead of an identity-focused way? So I think we'll have our speakers share their examples. Just take like a minute each to share your examples while folks are thinking in the chat. So Amanda Strawhacker, you're unmuted. Do you want to share first what your thoughts are?
Okay. So my example, and I thought hard about this because I'm really reflecting on Amanda Cardarelli's research. I think it's so interesting. I was thinking of when kids are sharing out the results of their work. So the reporting conclusions step. And instead of saying, you sounded like a real scientist there, which is something I do think I've heard people say, like, wow, that sounded so, I really believed you. You sounded like a scientist. You might say something like, I really like how you used evidence from your experiment when you were talking about what you found out. So really highlighting what it was that convinced you, what it was that they did. And since we're scientists, focusing on scientific accuracy and evidence is a nice way to do that.
Yeah, I love that. Seconding that, I would say just, pointing out to kids in the things that they're doing every day when they're, observing things, that's doing science. They're doing science when they're, asking questions. That's a part of doing science. So I think just really showing them that all of these little things that kids are already doing is doing science. And that's what scientists do. They're doing the thing that is doing science. So
that's the quote. They're doing the thing that's doing science. I love that. There's great examples in the chat. I love how you used your eyes to discover something new. I really like the question you were asking in your hypothesis, pointing out that they're applying what they learned to something else and that they're answering their own questions. And then a really fun physical suggestion was having students dance or use movement for each section of the scientific method, really turning it into a verb there rather than suggestion. So keep those suggestions coming. Keep those suggestions coming to us. Keep the conversations alive on Twitter and social media. Nancy can put our NGCP social media in the chat. We'd love for you to tell us how you're doing science and tag us, and we can share that. We'd love for you to come to our next webinar. If you enjoyed this one, it's all about paleontology. So please check out that event. But I really just want to thank our two speakers here today, Amanda Strawhacker and Amanda Cardarelli. You've really opened all of our eyes, mine included, from a caregiver parent perspective, as well as an educator and researcher. We got so many great ideas, and I really want to sincerely thank you both. If anyone here enjoyed this webinar as much as I did, consider showing your support to NGCP, and we will put that link in the chat to show how you can do that. And I would love to ask you all to take a couple of minutes to answer our post-webinar survey. We will put that in the chat, and it will also pop up once I close this event. This was really just such a joyful, wonderful, fun, and really interactive group. So thank you to everyone who came today. Thank you, Nancy, for moderating the chat and putting all those links in there. As I mentioned, the recording, the slides, the chat transcript, that will be made available to all of you. So thank you all so much. Let's all get off this call and go do some science. Take care, and I hope to see you at the next NGCP event. Bye.